This is Erin Harner, gut health, IBS, and SIBO coach and functional medicine dietitian. And I want to just welcome you here. This is the live Q&A with me. I had a number of questions submitted by community members, and I'm going to go through those now with you. All right, question came from Danielle. So she said, my gut symptoms always flare up around my period. Is that a thing? Love these questions. Okay, so let's shift into hormones for a second, because the gut and the hormones are really, really important. Gut hormones in particular around your period affect motility. So gut motility, progesterone equals slower digestion typically. Estrogen can affect the gut sensitivity and also the pain perception. Sometimes I'll see clients who around their period will have really bad cramps, and the pain can actually trigger like massive diarrhea. So like all month they're constipated, and then right before they have their period, they get diarrhea and get cleared out. And this is very, very likely related to the hormone shifts that happen around that time. So one of the things that's really important is to support hormone balance, and that can help reduce these flares. However, keep in mind that the hormone balance is strongly influenced by the gut. So gut and hormones are deeply close together as far as understanding how everything works. So gut and hormones. So we can't neglect to address the gut and just focus on hormones. I always start with the gut first, because if we can work on the gut, get the gut working properly, get digestion working properly, eating a great diet for that individual, we're going to radically improve how the person feels. And oftentimes the hormones will help to regulate themselves. And if they don't, then we know that we did our due diligence and we can address the hormones head on, but we've got to focus on the gut first. Great question, Danielle. I'm so glad that you asked. So I'm going to dive into this one from Heather. Heather asked something really smart. She said, is it better to avoid fiber during an IBS flare or keep eating it? So when we're thinking about an IBS flare, we're thinking about somebody who has diagnosed IBS, who's having a really tough time of it at the moment. So it could be a lot of bloating, gas, constipation, diarrhea, alternating constipation and diarrhea. Like the gut's really unhappy right now. So when we're thinking about when the gut's really unhappy, we want to think about making things more simple. Sometimes insoluble fiber, lots of insoluble fiber, like raw vegetables, for example, nuts and seeds, they can actually make flares worse because they're rough. They're a lot of roughage. They're kind of rough on the digestive system. They're not soft and soothing. Unlike soluble fiber, which is very soft and soothing, this would be a better source of fiber to focus on if you're in a flare. Things like oats or squash or chia seeds. And I know not everyone's a big fan of chia pudding, but I certainly am. It can be very, very helpful to soothe and calm the gut and also provide a lot of good nutrition. These soluble fiber sources are usually better tolerated than the really hard fibers. Also, I think about cooked versus raw. I'm a big fan, if somebody's in a flare, I'm a big fan of soups, really simple soups. Go easy on the garlic and onions, or remove the garlic and onions ideally. Really simple soups. Cooked vegetables really help the situation if you're in a flare. We want to keep things simple and not make it worse. Also, we're thinking about like temporary modification and not just cutting foods out of your diet long-term, right? A flare is something that's going to pass. We can simplify things for a short period of time to help make it better, but then we want to reintroduce those things and expand again, because we can't just take things out. It's going to wreak havoc on your gut microbiome. You're going to stop feeding your gut microbiome the nutrients that it needs to have a healthy commensal bacteria population, which radically impacts the function of the immune system and the gut barrier and all of the other things associated with it. So we want to make sure that if you're taking things out, you put them back in when the flare's problem. All right, we have a couple more questions. So what should I eat when my gut is flaring up? So this actually goes back to the question that we had that was from Heather. So when we're thinking about when your gut's flaring up, we're thinking about simplifying. Easy to digest meals, think soups, cooked vegetables, soft foods. You want to really avoid at that point when you're in a flare, in a lot of pain. You're going to avoid raw foods, spicy foods, high-fat foods temporarily. And you want to make sure that you're really hydrated. Lots of hydration, lots of minerals, maybe some electrolytes. And you want to also think about the size of your meal. Might not be the time to have like really large lunches and dinners. You might want to have slightly smaller meals short term until you're feeling a bit better. You also want to remember, like, let's address why you're having the flare in the first place. Okay, next question. If I get bloated after eating healthy foods, things like beans, broccoli, and apples, should I cut them out? And this question came from Lindsay, and this is a really good one. And this is kind of actually goes back to what I was just mentioning about cutting foods out. So what we know to be a fact is that the broader, the more variety you have in your diet, the more color, the more variety, the more fiber sources, the healthier your gut microbiome. And the healthier your microbiome, the more function it has. It's more functional. It's more able to do the things that it's supposed to do. So if we cut out large categories of foods without understanding what's actually going on, we're doing a disservice to our microbiome. However, there is some commonalities about these foods that Lindsay mentioned in her question. So the beans, the broccoli, and the apples. What's the commonality? The commonality is that these are all very high FODMAP foods. If you're not familiar with FODMAPs, FODMAPs are basically foods that contain carbohydrates that are extremely fermentable by your gut bacteria. And they're not necessarily very easy to digest. So they're often healthy, but they're not necessarily great for right now if every time you eat these foods, they're creating a lot of gas and bloating and stomach pain and constipation or diarrhea. So we need to address why these foods are triggering the issue. So is it okay to cut them out short term? Absolutely. Sure, no problem. What does short term mean? 2 to 4 weeks. If you take these out of your diet and you cut them out more than 4 weeks, we're missing a really critical component of our diet. That beans and broccoli and apples are super, super healthy foods. However, they're also highly fermentable. So unless you're addressing why your gut isn't able to tolerate these foods at the same time as cutting them out, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice, because when you try to reintroduce them, they're probably going to still not feel very good in your belly. So it's really important to do the gut repair, because that's going to allow for reintroduction of these foods. The likelihood that if you took these foods out, you would be able to tolerate them later is pretty high if you do some work to work on the gut. And that's one of the things that I do in my program, the Gut Balance Method, and I would encourage you to schedule a call with me. The other thing to think about is understanding what your triggers are is kind of tricky. It's not super straightforward. There are a lot of things that can potentially trigger symptoms, and unless you have a big picture overview as to what's actually going on, it can be very hard to understand what's actually triggering it. There's different timings, like how soon after you introduce a food is it going to contribute to an issue? Where is that food in the digestive tract at that point? We also have carbs and proteins and fats all affect our digestive system differently and at different rates. So unless you have an understanding of how this all works, it's very difficult to spot triggers and what's going on. Instead of just cutting out whole categories of foods, we can be very targeted by cutting out only the foods that are actually contributing to them. All right, next question. So do I really need to be low FODMAP if I have IBS? This one was from Nicole. Okay, let's talk low FODMAP for just a second. So low FODMAP is a tool. It is not a forever plan. If you're not familiar with FODMAPs, FODMAP stands for fermentable, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, FODMAPs. What we need to know here is that they're fermentable carbohydrates. Basically, if we think about going on a low FODMAP diet for a long period of time, it can actually reduce microbial diversity. But a short period of time, it can be very, very helpful to understand what foods might be triggering symptoms, and it can really help calm the gut if you're in a flare or have a lot of symptoms going on right now. So the answer would be yes and no. Yes, you could do it short term. No, you should not be on it long term. What the FODMAP diet was meant to do is to be an elimination reintroduction protocol. It was not eliminate all these foods from your diet long term. That was not how it was designed at all. And there's some really good research and data that show that if somebody who is diagnosed with IBS going on a low FODMAP food plan for 2 to 4 weeks can have significant improvements in symptoms. And that's something that I do share with my clients in the Gut Balance Method, as well as lots of meal plans and other resources. But does everybody who has IBS need to be on a low FODMAP diet? Absolutely not. Especially if that's not the problem. You've got to figure out what the problems are. Next up, this one is from Melissa. So Melissa nailed the question that I think everyone wants to ask, and that's, how do I even start figuring out what foods are triggering my symptoms? I sit down to a meal and I just don't know. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but when you sit down to a meal and you're like, it's a gamble, it's a crapshoot, I have no idea how I'm going to react to this. I'm feeling pretty good right now, and I think this is going to be okay, but I don't actually know. Or you go out to a restaurant and you order something that you're pretty sure is going to be fine, and afterwards, an hour, 2 hours later, you're like, I guess that wasn't so fine. So if that's you, listen up here. So if you're trying to figure out what's triggering your symptoms, you've really got to understand a few key components here. One is timing that I mentioned. There we have carbohydrates that are going to have reactions in the gut like within 1 to 2 hours or so, 1 to 3 hours. We're going to have reactions to proteins that could be a few hours to a couple of days. You can have a food today and it could affect you 2 days later. It's very difficult to understand what's going on there. And when we're thinking about this, we've got to think about tracking, and we've got to understand that the patterns are much more important than like single foods. So when you're sitting down to a meal, you can have confidence that, like this meal, I'm going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I don't have to be like in bed or with a heat pad on my belly for the rest of the day. So understanding what your triggers are is a really, really important step in allowing your body to be okay with the food, so you can reduce food fear when you're sitting down to a meal, and also have some confidence that the food that you're eating is actually serving you. All right, next up was a question from Laura. She asked, I've had reflux forever and take meds daily. Is there another way? Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and something that is not something that the functional medicine world and the allopathic Western medicine world necessarily agree about. But let me explain the mechanism behind how this works. Okay, so oftentimes we think about reflux as being too much acid. Very, very rarely is it a problem of too much acid. It's actually usually a problem of too little acid. So what you might be referring to here with meds, she didn't tell me what meds she was taking, but if we think about proton pump inhibitors, for example, those can actually turn off your stomach's ability to produce acid. And that makes you feel better, because if there's not acid in your stomach, you can't have reflux. It's not going to erode your esophagus. It's not going to feel awful when you lay down because you just turned off acid production. The problem with turning off acid production using PPIs or proton pump inhibitors, and then there's another class that's a little less aggressive than the PPIs that are often over the counter. But if we think about turning down or lowering stomach acid production, the problem with this, and it's a really big problem, the problem is that when we turn down stomach acid production, we turn down our ability to break down nutrients, to cut proteins into little bits, to unfurl proteins, to absorb nutrients. B12, for example, requires good stomach acid to be absorbed. Iron requires stomach acid to be absorbed. So if we turn off our production of stomach acid, we open ourselves up to a host of problems with nutrient absorption. And also we can sometimes mask symptoms because we've turned off the stomach acid. Also, I see this a lot with people who have been on proton pump inhibitors for a long time. They have been taking these medications for a long time that turn off stomach acid, and they develop a lot of pain and bloating. And kind of earlier we were talking about SIBO and these symptoms related to SIBO. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth can sometimes be a result of not enough stomach acid, because what is the function of stomach acid? Right? One of the main functions of stomach acid is to actually kill the pathogens that are coming in through our food and our air and our water and the things that are coming in through our mouth. So if we're not properly killing off the pathogens, they can go right through the stomach and take up residence in the small intestine. And those aren't always coming from outside us. Sometimes they're coming from our oral cavity or our mouth. You're constantly swallowing saliva, and those can go straight through the stomach, not get killed off, and then take up residence in the small intestine. So yes, there is another way, 100%. Usually I work in partnership with clients, physicians, to slowly lower proton pump inhibitors if possible, with the support of the doctors. Never, ever, ever should this be something that you do on your own. And yes, long-term reflux, it needs a functional understanding of what's actually going on. There sometimes can be not just a stomach acid issue, sometimes there's a bacteria that takes up residence in the stomach that can affect stomach acid production. Sometimes there's an intra-abdominal pressure problem, sometimes it's a motility problem, sometimes there's trigger foods. So it really requires an understanding of what's going on. And if you want to talk with me again, I'd be happy to schedule a gut health assessment call and talk through that with you. All right. Well, there were some really great questions that came in. Also, if you're still watching and these questions hit close to home, I just want to let you know that you're not broken. Your symptoms are not your fault. If they're still there and you've tried a bunch of things and you're like, I don't know what to do next, nothing is helping, it's likely that you don't have the right plan, or you haven't dug deep enough yet to figure out what the root causes of the actual issue are. We talked about IBS. We talked about lots of different symptoms. These symptoms don't just come out of the blue. They're red flags. They're your body telling you that something is going on, and you probably need to address it, because if you don't address it, what happens is over time it gets worse. So if you're frustrated, if you're feeling stuck, if you're like, I've tried this antibiotic and that antibiotic and my SIBO keeps coming back, like, book a call with me. I would love to chat because it's likely that you're missing something. We're not digging deep enough. There are roots underneath the surface that we can't see because all we're doing is we're looking at the tree and all the symptoms on the tree, the gas, the bloating, the diarrhea, the constipation, the reflux, etc. They're all in the tree. We haven't dug into the roots. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye, friends.